Ladies and gentlemen, I think that we can start. President Cardoso, President Barosso, welcome to this panel, and thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Institute Cardoso, OCP Policy Center, and German Marshall Fund for this seminar that has been very interesting. Since this morning, we have talked about trade, we've talked about agriculture, talked about Africa, we've talked, of course, about the Atlantic and the security in the Atlantic. When many years ago, when we talked about the Atlantic and cooperation in the Atlantic, it was basically North Atlantic cooperation between and living in the Cold War, and it was transatlantic cooperation between the United States and Europe. A few years ago, in Morocco, we had the idea, and especially the OCP Policy Center had the idea that the Atlantic was something new, and it was no longer the Northern Atlantic, but it was the whole basin of the Atlantic, and that there were common threats and common opportunities. Africa has been evolving, have known very important growth, and we thought, and Latin America the same, and United States and Europe the same. Things had changed. So we invented this concept of the Atlantic Dialogues, and we are the fourth edition. The fourth edition will happen in October next year in Marrakesh, I think. So my first question about President Cardoso and President Barosso is whether you see that there is a room for this cooperation in the Atlantic Basin, north, south, east, west, and going beyond what was the common knowledge in the past. So this is my first question. The second question will be about Africa. We talked a lot about Africa, about the possibilities of cooperation and work with Africa. I've been working in Africa for the last 3 years. I have been a diplomat for many, many years, and then since 2011, I've been advising some groups for their expansion in Africa, and I've been traveling all around Africa. What I can tell you about Africa, it's an unbelievably evolving continent. And today, the big difference between Africa of today and Africa of 40 years ago, 20 years ago, is that you have an unbelievable young professionals all over the places that can make the difference. I believe that the insuccess or the failure of Africa in the beginning, in the first 40 years, was due to the fact that they had nobody. There were nobody to build the countries. Today, you have absolutely fantastic people all over the countries. Our friend Tijan Gado is one of them. We have another one, Hassan Ba, who is here, and many, many others. Vera this morning, and many others. So Africa is evolving. It's becoming a real continent of opportunities, and it will be the new frontier. Do you believe that we can work together, all together in Africa? Morocco is developing a policy towards Africa, and we are investing a lot in Africa. And my third question will be to President Barosso. Oh, by the way, about Africa, we talked a lot about isolationism of Brazil, the lack of will of Brazil. Well, actually, things happened. Between 2000 and 2014, I think that BNDES spent something like $2.9 billion there. And the number of embassies, Brazilian embassies in Africa, went from 17 to 37, I think, between 2002 and 2014. So things are happening, but is it enough? Everybody's believing that it's not enough. President Barosso, I wanted to ask you something. Europe, the European Union, is the most integrated region in the world, by far. It is the most trade open region in the world, by far. It's the one that receives more investments in the world. But we have seen strange things happening in the last few years. We've hearing a lot about European bashing. It's European bashing all the time. We have political parties like UKIP. We have the Front National. We are actually talking a lot about, putting an end to Schengen. I mean, this is very worrying for everybody who's working, for all our countries that are working and believed a lot in the European Union. And the European Union, and for us, the European Union was a model that everybody wanted to follow. We used to say, well, if the Maghreb could be European Union, it would be fantastic. Well, today, we see that there is a lot of second thoughts. What will be the future, according to you, President Barroso? So I think that we are here to listen to President Cardoso, to President Barroso. I finished, and you're not going to hear from me. Thank you. President Cardoso.
Well, thank you very much for having this, for coming, first of all, and then for helping us to have a sound discussion about the issues have been proposed by the Atlantic Strategic Group. You asked me about, is it possible to a common view, or at least to take into account conjointly Europe, Africa, North America, and South America? Well, I agree with what has been said by Ambassador Sergio Amaral. If you look from the perspective, from our heart, no doubts about it. The answer is yes, yes. Mainly with respect to Africa, because we have, as everyone knows, since the beginning of our country, the presence of people coming from Africa. I myself, I started my academic life long time ago, dealing with the problem of the blacks in Brazil. And this is not one specific case. It's very common in Brazil to have some consideration about what is the influence of Africa on Brazil and so on and so forth, and vice versa. I would like to remind you that under the military regime in Brazil, very important attempts of establishing a more sound relationship with Africa haven't been done. At that time, the idea was it's important for Brazil to consolidate, because of the Atlantic Basin, to consolidate our relationship with Africa. And I remember when I became president, I went several times to Africa, but very often I have been there to cancel debts, because the military regime was able to offer, credit, and in order to benefit the Brazilian companies too, but the end result was not positive. So we had relations, and the relationship were to some extent failed, because we never really connected in a positive way. Now I would say the situation is different. Not just Africa changed a lot, but also the way how Brazilians are looking after Africa is also changing. Big companies, I know there are a few, but anyhow, important companies are operating in Africa, are investing in Africa, not just in South Africa, but mainly in Angola, Mozambique, because of the Portuguese Africa, but also in Nigeria, in other parts of Africa. In terms not just of heart, but also in terms of minds, there are some relationships are becoming more important for both sides, for us and for some African countries. Well, to look together, North America, Africa, Europe, and South America is a little bit more complicated. How to put all these elements together. There is one important question to be stressed. The fact that now we are no more reasoning in terms of South-South, because your question raised the question of North-South, East-West. I think this is important to stress, because this is globalization. We cannot look never more in only one direction. We have to look, multi-direction. And in the last 20 years, Brazil's attempting to have this more ample comprehension of the global process. With respect to Europe, no doubts about, since the beginning, when we were created in Brazil and in South America, Mercosur, the idea was to repeat to some extent what has been done in Europe, you see. And then immediately we tried to get in touch with the European Union to see about the possibility to have a common trade treaty. And at the time, the idea was how to respond to a challenge raised by the United States, what consisted in the FTAA. Brazil never was able to respond on a homogeneous way the challenge presented by the Americans to organize a common hemispheric market. We have been always doubtful in Brazil. I'm not speaking just about the government, also the economic force in Brazil. I had several discussions with several important sectors in Brazil, and it was not clear. From our point of view, it would be important to have this hemispheric, free trade area or not. And in our mind, the idea is, well, maybe if you include Europe, and if you have a more special relationship with Europe, this will give us more strength to accept the challenge presented by the Americans. The point is that at one point in time, both sides, United States and Brazil, decided not to go ahead with the idea. Looking from today back, maybe it was a mistake not to go ahead with the idea. It was a mistake, but the mistake was not only Brazilian. It was also American, you see. And the decision was done in Miami, and the reasoning was, let's go bilateral. The United States had the capacity to bilaterally to make an agreement with every one of the Latin American countries, and we didn't. So we became a little bit more isolated into Mercosur. And Mercosur never have become what was the initial proposal, a really integrated area. It became something of a nightmare. Every new meeting, ministerial meeting, Mercosur ministerial meeting, normally was in order to allow more exceptions, not to be in agreement with what has been accorded before. So this is going on and on. So now we are more isolated. And this is the situation now. I would say, yes, now we have much more in terms of our minds, the sense that it's positive for us to go together. It's difficult to see how to put together the East, West, North, and South, but then we will say we have a little bit more interest in that. But then how we are all time, because we are a big country, we are all time, balancing what's better for us. There is a sentence in Brazilian national anthem who says, "We'll be sleeping forever in a splendid cradle." Well, the isolation would be like America in 19th century. You see, we are always with some anxiety. What is good for us, to be alone or to be together? You see, so this is normal in terms of big countries. I remember once I was in Uruguay, a small Uruguay, member of the Mercosur, very good relationship with Brazil, and I was there making a state visit to Uruguay, making speeches, being received honorary degrees here and there, all around. And suddenly, the Central Bank of Brazil took a decision without any information to the president or to the ministers against Uruguay. Because the bureaucracy was not caring. What's that? See? Of course, it was a minimum question from the Brazilian point of view, but it was terrible from the Uruguayan point of view. This is a natural way the Brazilian bureaucracy reacts as a big bureaucracy, imperial bureaucracy, so on and so forth. So the response is yes, it will be always a little bit more complicated than with respect to maybe other countries. With Europe, we always are hoping that one day we will have this connection. With America, we don't know what to do. And I would say in the last let's say, 10 years, the situation is worsening, in the sense that we are becoming much more, oriented by values of not isolation, but anyhow suspicious vis-a-vis the foreigners, foreigners. So that is my answer. I think it's positive, it's available, but still it will take time to give more consistency to the idea of a sound cooperation, not governed by country by country. This is feasible. We are trying already to do. But in terms of a collective responsibility, it's difficult. You said something very important, not you, the former chairman, very important. In order to have a say at the world level, we have to have a responsibility and to have a side. And Brazil is always ambiguous in that respect. You never know. Are we really, from what side are we? So this is maybe, is a process of growing up. It's a kind of question of time, and we'll start step by step. Where I hope we will be capable to say more effective to you, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, President.
First of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with one of the statesmen I most admire, my friend Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and also with our moderator, Aziz Mekouar. And my answer to you is clearly, this is a very interesting concept, the Atlantic concept enlarged, because it enables us to overcome two problems of the organization of the world in the past: the East-West division, polarization, or the North-South polarization. As you said, in Europe, when we say Atlantic, we think about the transatlantic relationship between Europe and the United States, and also Canada, but mainly people think about Europe and the United States, and also NATO, and so on and so forth. That's the concept, Atlanticist concept. So if we think about Atlantic not just as something that comes from the old time, I hope it will be really old time, of the Cold War, but of engaging partners like Latin America, all the Americas in fact, and Africa, I think it's good for the new order that we try now to build. Because in fact, this is the issue of the 21st century, an issue that was very brilliantly discussed also by the panel before us. We are missing a global order today. And the biggest task we have in the beginning of this 21st century is to create the new order of the globalization age. There is not. We had the Cold War. It was well characterized by Raymond Aron and others. But today, we are missing an order. And we need some elements, some building blocks for that order. And we are looking, searching for that order. The other point is also to overcome the, I would like to think, old polarization, north and south. Because we need, in fact, to be together, countries from the north and countries from the south. So the concept is very interesting. Now, to make it work, that's more challenging, as President Fernando Henrique Cardoso mentioned. And I believe, and that's a point I would like to underline, that we need more structure also in these different regions. Europe, and we can come afterwards to Europe if you want, and you put me a challenging question. Europe is indeed the most advanced case ever of regional cooperation and integration in the history of international relations. It's not perfect, it's certainly not perfect, and after leading the European Commission 10 years, I can tell you why it's not perfect. But at the end it works. At the end, it is possible to say this is the opinion of those today 28 countries. It's amazing. 28 countries, they think we know the nuance, we know the differences, but if you look at the way they vote in the United Nations, I mean, it's 99.99% the same. So there is no other case in the history of international relations comparable. But when you go to Africa, and we heard very brilliant comments of our friend, Minister Gadio, it's difficult. The countries, not even regional integration, the reality is that regional integration is incipient. those countries, very often, they trade more with the former colonial power than among themselves. There is not a common market. I mean, in Maghreb, you know that, between Morocco, Algeria, and Mercosur, as President Fernando Henrique Cardoso said, also is so far an attempt that has not delivered the expected results. So we need that these groups of countries assume themselves with open regionalism. So I think the question of regionalism that Álvaro Vasconcelos mentioned is of the essence today. Because we saw that after namely the financial crisis, as highlighted in fact, and Professor Valadão mentioned also the new economic challenges, that the institutions of the past are no longer up to the job. The reality is that today there is a crisis of legitimacy and effectiveness, even I would say more decisive than legitimacy in this case is effectiveness of the United Nations on one side, with the Security Council that people believe it's no longer representative. This is the reality. And also the Bretton Woods institutions. By the way, it's not by accident that the Chinese started with this Asian Investment in Infrastructure Bank, and with, I think, a big mistake of the American administration. American administration that was saying that they were going to pivot to Asia, and afterwards was very surprised when Europeans pivoted to Asia, and the Europeans joined that Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank in contradiction with the American position. So we need new ways of structure. I don't think we should replace what exists before we have tested the new. It's more in terms of complementarity than in terms of replacement that I think. And we are in that process. Some countries, and then it comes to Brazil, let me say something from outside from Brazil. I think Brazil has indeed a unique position because Brazil is an American country, but it's also European and African for the reasons that were also mentioned. And it's a big country, by the way, a member of the G20. But Brazil can do it on its own if it has the will to do it, to mobilize resources, to assume responsibility, as you have mentioned. But others don't have that means. Let's make it clear. That's why we in Europe, yesterday I mentioned that for those who were present in our very nice dinner, I think the biggest driver for the European integration in the future, that's why I'm confident, in spite of all the difficulties, is globalization. Because Germany, France, other countries, they have understood that on their own they are no longer able to discuss in equal footing with big powers in the world. That's the reality. I mean, Jean Monnet has said it, one of the founding fathers of European integration. He said it in the 50s. Our countries of today are not in a position to discuss with the Americans and the Soviet Union of today, and will no longer be able to discuss with the China and India of tomorrow. This is exactly what's happening. And that's why we need scale. And by sharing sovereignty, by, in a way, replacing the old categories of the nation state will remain the most important unit in international relations. Certainly, I am not an idealist to that. I mean, I'm an idealist, but at the same time, I keep some realism. But we need also to create new forms of cooperation or governance, whatever we may call it, for this 21st world. That's why I believe we are in a transition phase that explains the angst, the anxiety that we are feeling today. Sometimes that angst is a little bit misguided. I mean, if you look statistically, and there are some awful accountings, la comptabilité de la mort, la contabilidade da morte, there are people who compare how many people die in wars. The 20th century was much worse than this 21st century. If you count the casualties provoked by the 2 world wars, by the Vietnam War, the Korea War, we are very far away. What we have now are more conflicts, but not so generalized as before. And in fact, I would like here to contradict a little bit the tone I've heard before. Not everything is bad. I mean, globalization is bringing many people out of hunger. The opportunities of knowledge, of information, of culture today are immensely superior than the previous generation. I was 18 years of age when my country became a democracy. I could not read the books I wanted. Today, even in totalitarian systems, it's difficult sometimes for the governments to forbid people to have access to information. So I believe innovation and science and technology, raising some problems, is basically something positive, and we should encourage it. We should not fear globalization. We should try to shape it. We should civilize globalization. And that's why I believe if you would be able to put those groups together, Europe, America, North America, and the United States, that remain the biggest power in the world, a power in crisis, a power that many people now believe that has no longer also the capacity, because of ambiguities, to direct the evolution of the world, but is still the biggest power in defense technological terms. And of course Latin America, with a specific important role for Brazil, and Africa, if Africa also goes on in this process of integration. And I believe these units can be important elements to give some structure. One of the interesting developments after the financial crisis was the creation of G20. I participated in it. In fact, it was a European initiative. It was during the French presidency. President Sarkozy and myself, we went to convince President George W. Bush, Camp David, to organize it. At that time, the Americans did not want, because we are speaking in Chatham House rules, I understand, that's what was agreed. The point was that since the financial crisis started with the Lehman Brothers case and all these problems and subprime crisis, and afterwards, of course, had a very important impact in Europe, also with sovereign debt crisis. But in fact, it started in the United States, that's the reality. At that moment, for President Bush, it appeared that it was not good to organize something in the United States. And we asked him to do it precisely to avoid a kind of a return to naked, ugly protectionism, to try to give some order. It was evident for us that at that time, the G8, at that time Russia was part of G8, was no longer able to cope with it. We need the so-called BRICS and other countries. And that was the first summit we had. It was the end of 2008, I think, in Washington. Afterwards, there was another one in London, and afterwards another one in Pittsburgh, and so on and so forth. And it became the primary economic forum. It is considered by themselves, they stated, Brazil is part of it, but no. But other Latin American countries, I mean, it's only Mexico and Argentina. And from Africa, it's only South Africa. And as was said, South Africa does not represent at all Africa, at all. And the other African countries, for those who know Africa, know well what the others think about that. So this is why, in fact, we need to think beyond the G20. The G20, I think, is doing a good job, even if now it enters a little bit in routine, in bureaucratic mode. But it's important to have some kind of a instance, some kind of level where we have no longer the polarization either between the G7 and the rest of or the BRICS. By the way, Russia was in both. Now it's only in one. It was invited to leave because after what happened with Ukraine, a very important development that I'm afraid that people outside, probably here in Brazil, have not understood the profound impact it had in Europe and in the world order. In Europe, this is changing completely the perceptions. And in fact, as we know, if there is no European order, there is a risk that there is no world order. That's, I mean, whether we like it or not, this is the reality still. And that's why I think we need to build this new order. And if you have cooperation through different parts of our world, I think it's a positive development. Now we have to make it happen, and that requires, I think, more structure and more determination.
Let me add something. Barroso added an important element. He said, there is no a global order. It's true. The last book by Kissinger is about that point. It's true. We have maybe an order after the Second World War, United Nations. It was an important attempt. Was successful in ending up to now a big world war. This is very important. That's why we are in a better situation today. But anyhow, a global order implies a order taking into account what's going on because of globalization and implying all countries of the world and have a governance to that. We don't have that. This is true. We don't have that. And in that sense, we are maybe in a step back. And why? Because of what has been said several times along our seminar here. The Americans, at one point in time, tried to, because of their sense of mission, to impose democracy all around. And this has been a failure. It has been a failure in Iraq, in Libya, all around was a fear. And also because it was extremely difficult for the Americans and for Europe too to accept Russia as a real partner. I remember I had a conversation with Putin in the year 2000, and Putin was regretting the fact that the Americans were starting the war on the stars. And he said, well, the only one country at the time, China was not yet a superpower. The only country capable to compete with the Americans is Russia. And we don't want that. We want one thing. They have to respect us. Of course, inside the concept to respect us, maybe the great Russia is behind. But anyhow, the idea for Putin was, I like to be a friend. I don't want to be a fool. I remember, I don't know exactly when, with respect to Iran, the same. I was attending a meeting at the United Nations, and the president of Iran, Khatami, I guess, asked me for a conversation. I had a long conversation with him, and he said, well, I would like to convince the Americans that what is my goal is to prove that it's possible a cooperation, separation between religion and state. A secular state is my objective. Well, of course, I try to transmit to the USA the importance of the desire expressed by the president of Iran, but the response was negative, always suspicious vis-à-vis Iran. So now with respect to Iran, they are maybe trying to solve the question. I don't know to what extent this will be done. But with Russia, it's now much more difficult because of Ukraine. Ukraine was really a very dramatic step, a wrong step from the global point of view, a wrong step. But then how is that? See? So it has been difficult for the Western to understand the non-Western world. Extremely difficult, including Africa. Maybe not with respect to us, Latin America, because we are more, as I said, more Westernized anyhow. Yeah? But to understand the important, and positive decision by the Americans was with respect to China. Because with China, they understood that it was important to have some kind of bridge between China and the United States. And this is what is keeping the world more or less organized. More or less organized. So, in that sense, you are absolutely right. It will be extremely important to try to create a global order in that sense. In the new global order, we will imply not just governments, but people, civil society, business. So it's quite different from what has been done after the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, 51 countries together took the decision to organize the situation among those nations, you see? But we are only 51. But now that's not enough. We have 198, and that's not enough because we have business, we have religions, we have a planetary civil society emerging, and we have internet. So how to put all this together?
If I may, thank you very much. Just regarding Russia, let me tell you the following. I fully agree that there were some behaviors on our side, namely on the American side, because now there was a difference between Europe and the United States, the way to deal with Russia, to be honest, that humiliated unnecessarily Russia. Russia is one of the biggest, it's in fact geographically the biggest country in the world, a very important country. And after the end of the Cold War, there was some kind of humiliation of Russia. For me, Putin is the leader outside of Europe that I've met the most all these 10 years. I met him, according to my cabinet, 25 times because of the very intense relationship that the European Union had with Russia. And Putin, for me, is a product of resentment. Yeah. When he said that the biggest tragedy of the 20th century was the implosion of the collapse of the Soviet Union, he meant it. It was exactly what he thought. Having said this, it's important to understand the motives behind Putin, but that does not justify what he has done. No. Because, in fact, the annexation of Crimea is, I think, the most clear violation of the international order since the end of the Cold War. because it is a violation of the United Nations Charter, a violation of the Helsinki Final Act, a violation of a specific agreement for the denuclearization of Ukraine, where Russia was a guarantor of the integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine. And that's why the international community, I think, should not accept it, because if you accept that one country, by the way, the biggest country in the world, takes part of another one, smaller, invoking linguistic or ethnic motives, I mean, what kind of world are we going to live in the future? That's the point. Now, but the point I like to make now, following the President Cardoso remarks, is this about this order being not only for the governments, but for people. And I think this is indeed today the greatest challenge. The internet, the digital age, something that Mr. Valadão, Professor Valadão mentioned, and I want to underline, the role of the political parties. Some time ago, I was in the Davos, and in one of those restricted conversations, I will not attribute the comments, but one leader of one NGO was saying, we were a small group, and was saying, now parties do not count in the world. What we need is NGOs. We are going to transform the world. And I interrupted. I said, look, by the way, the Commission, the European Commission was one of the biggest, we are the biggest funding source of that NGO, okay. But I support you fully. But at the end, it's not NGOs that are going to run for elections. It's the Front National. It's UKIP. It's the political leaders. And today, there is a lack of prestige of political parties in all our democracies. What happened in Europe, from that point of view, and I'm answering your second question, Aziz, is devastating. From a party led by a clown in Italy, Mr. Grillo, to very hard right, extreme right, populist, sometimes xenophobic, sometimes racist kind of parties. So these demons, these devils that are devils of the European history, have been sleeping, but they are not dead. That's why we need to be attentive to that. But also, it's not only in Europe. I mean, now I'm living in the States at Princeton University. I mean, the Tea Party, it's a manifestation of extreme populism. It's a resistance to, by the way, President Obama, the last summit we had in Brussels, we discussed this, and he agreed that it was the same kind of reaction to the globalization. People understand that the governments are no longer able to deliver, and so they are trying to close themselves, to be more protective, to be more sometimes nationalistic, as we say so in French, souverainiste. And so there is, in fact, that risk. So today, I remember in my young life, I mean, to be a leader in a party was some kind of prestige. Today, the brightest people in Europe do not want to go to any party.
They go to financial market.
Good financial. And so, and I don't know how it is in Brazil, but I will not comment on Brazil. By the way, on Brazil, entre parenthèses, I think that your problem in Brazil, and I say that with great friendship, is that your society is much more advanced than your political system. And the political system has not yet, what's happening in Brazil, from my point of view, is in the medium term quite good. It's a kind of modernization. The political system has not followed at a sufficient pace the transformation in society. And by the way, I'm reassured, because for me, Brazil, the sovereign power in Brazil is freedom of expression. And this is the important thing. With a democracy, there are always ways to find a solution. But this is the point. So we have to have a global order, as President Fernando Henrique Cardoso said, that is not just about intergovernmental, but that is able to cope with this increased diversity in variety, complexity, coming from the developments in science, technology, communication, and in our civil societies. For that, we need leadership at all levels, leadership also in the civil society and in the political parties. When the political parties lose the prestige that have, when the mainstream parties lose, in fact, there is a temptation to go for the extremes, and that's what we are seeing also partly in Europe, but not only in Europe, to be frank.